We're live. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Hooray, hooray. Good to see everyone who is watching us online. Apreciados amigos y amigas, que alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, what a joy it is that we're here together at All Saints Church. Mi nombre es Mike Kinman. My name is Mike Kinman. Soy rector. I am the rector. Mi pronombre son él. My pronouns are he, him. It is great to be here in the forum. Part of what's happened is since we went online for a lot of 18 months and so many wonderful people became part of this community during that time, we really want to make sure we're doing everything both in person and online as much as possible. So sometimes we're still sussing out the technology. So can we just first of all thank Manny Carrillo and Keith Holman for everything that they do. And the person you don't see is Nader El-Dahabi, who is our Director of Information Technology. So big thanks to Nader. So I'm going to try to talk as little as possible because we want to spend as much time as possible with our guest. For the forums this month, we're doing a series on a topic that has, over the last 18 months, become incredibly important to really everyone around the world. It probably was to begin with, but we've become more aware of it. And that's public health. And we really are trying to do is break down that phrase, that term, into its component parts and then reassemble it again and then really look at what does this mean for us. So last week we had Dr. Peter Mancall from the Departments of History and Anthropology at the University of Southern California. We looked at that word public. And Dr. Mancall went to the colonial roots of what we now call the United States. The Europeans who came over and colonized this area, some of the relationships that they had with the indigenous peoples here, and looked at some of the questions of what does it mean to have a sense of the common good? How do you balance common good with personal gain? What were the different views on that, and how have those threads gone through to today? Today we're looking at the word health, and we've thrilled to have with us Dr. Linda James Myers, who is Professor Emerita at Ohio State University. Professor James Myers specializes in psychology and culture, moral and spiritual identity development, healing practices and psychotherapeutic processes, and intersections of race, gender, and class. She is internationally known for her work in the development of what's called a theory of optimal psychology, which focuses on the interconnectedness that one has to all living people and things, and the important role that one's culture and spiritual nature can have creating healthy mindsets. Dr. James Myers' oneness model of human functioning offers a transdisciplinary focus that builds on insights from the wisdom tradition of African deep thought and converges with modern physics and Eastern philosophies. Her current research interests comprise the application of that model to a broad range of issues from health and education to business ethics. Dr. James Myers has received numerous honors and awards for excellence in research and scholarship, including being named Distinguished Psychologist by the Association of Black Psychologists, and is also a past president of the Association of Black Psychologists. And we are grateful to have you here, Dr. James Myers. And at this point, I just want to say thank you for being here, and I want to turn it over to you to lead us on a journey about health. So take it away.
Thank you so much. It's quite an honor and pleasure to be here with All Saints Church. And I have to shout out to Dr. Brunel Anderson for the hookup. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are committed to the health and sustainable well-being of themselves and humanity about health. And so I love the topic I'll be focusing on today, health and health matters. So I thought I would look today at health matters, achieving wellness and sustainable well-being. And I guess in order to do that, I should, if I can get my PowerPoint to move, I should start with some questions. And that will give us the context for what I will be doing. And I'm not sure. Let's see here. Why my slides? Okay, here we go. Health matters. How will we know what health is if one lives in a nation society that from its inception has been built on toxic ideologies, pathological behaviors, and a sick care system masquerading as health care? I understand last week you talked about the common good, and the common good versus personal gain. And I think I'm continuing that conversation as we think about health in the context within which it emerges, which is it's a social phenomena as well as an individual personal phenomena. But with this question, what I'm trying to do is call our attention to the fact that for many of us in this society, the last thing we think of relative to promoting good health is our nation society, which has from its inception been built on toxic ideologies of white supremacy, systems of dehumanization, and so forth. And acknowledging that is indeed not a healthcare system we experience in this society, but rather a sick care system. Meaning that until very recently, our focus in allopathic medicine has been on bring me your symptoms, I will diagnose what's going on based on your symptoms, and I will prescribe medications based on that identification of symptom. No mention there about cure, no mention there about the context, and as a consequence, we're in the midst of a pandemic that has proven very troublesome. So where within the current prevailing cultural mindset do we see the way of opening for a truly healthy, holistic wellness? Where do we see that occurring, given our current prevailing mindset, which I just described? And the last question is, what is needed to achieve optimal health? And most of my research has been based on not only the idea of optimal health, but an optimal psychology that can get us there. So I am going to show up a little training guide that I created as a part of a research project I did some years ago, a community participatory project that looked at Our Health Matters, a guide to an African Indigenous American psychology and cultural model for creating a climate and culture of optimal health. So you've hit a subject matter that's really dear to my heart. So what do we need? Needed is a depth of understanding capable of revealing, healing, and reversing the damage of moral bankruptcy, fractured consciousness, spiritual alienation, conceptual incarceration, and intellectual imperialism. These have led to a dis-ease in every area of life, from the personal to the global, driven by the highest values for materialistic greed, power over, and control. So what we haven't done in this social context, given the mindset into which we've been socialized, is really look at health as a multi-dimensional phenomena that has many layers and many levels, and we haven't focused on the interrelatedness and interdependence of all things. That kind of thinking is not characteristic of our mindset. So what we're going to do briefly this morning is talk about psychological knowledge converging around the heights of knowledge across cultural groups, and how crucial that is to the creation of health, mental, physical, spiritual, social, and environmental, and sustainable well-being. And I'm going to draw on the basis for my research and the development of my theory of optimal psychology, also known as optimal conceptual theory, which is the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, which I believe yields insights and understanding humanity desperately needs at this time. So I'm beginning with a quote by Anna Julia Cooper in 1892, where she talks about feeling it essential to a perfect understanding and equitable verdict that the truth from each standpoint be presented at the bar, and that this little voice that has been added to the chorus, already full chorus, the other side has not been represented by one who lives there. And I wanted to begin with that quote because a couple of things are not typical in terms of how I'm approaching this topic. One, I'm using an African-centered, feminine voice in construction of reality, and I'm raising questions from that voice that I think are essential to our understanding and appreciating not only what health is, but how to achieve it. So my research interest over the many years has been dedicated to creating a theory of human development that really answers questions that heretofore mainstream Western psychology has kind of avoided. And my questions really emerge from the historical realities of being a person of both African and Native American descent. And the questions that emerged that drove my development of the theory was trying to understand what could the people who captured and enslaved millions of Africans as caste chattel be thinking that they could behave so heinously. And then the next question was, and how did my ancestors survive almost 250 years of chattel enslavement, caste enslavement, emerging as the moral and spiritual leaders for the fight for civil rights for all? Those two questions to me were critical if we were really going to understand human development in any kind of comprehensive, cohesive, or coherent fashion. If we don't understand what's driving behaviors, if we don't understand what maintains them, and particularly if we only look at the people who were the captors and enslavers and acknowledge that mindset is the one that's prevailing today, but we don't look at the mindset of the people who endured that for 250 years without any human rights whatsoever. What could they be thinking? And then another 150 years under socially sanctioned, legally sanctioned domestic terrorism. And then the last 50 plus years still fighting and struggling for the same rights they'd always fought for. So these are the two driving questions that really prompted me to begin to think critically and deeply about health from a psychological vantage point, because we know today, even from a Western perspective, much of our health is related to our thinking and our belief system. So, in answer to those questions, what I began to see is that the worldview of the caste, chattel, and enslavers and their progeny, fostering that heinous behavior that endorsed kidnap, terrorism, dehumanization, and the trafficking of millions of people of African descent as chattel to build their personal and national wealth. Whatever that worldview was, it was structured such that that became okay. It became normalized. And it is the foundation upon which the wealth of this nation is built. That same mindset was able to discover lands, colonize them, killing off the prior inhabitants and forcing them onto reservations. That mindset was capable of doing that. And that mindset also dwelt in alternative facts, developing hegemonic narratives such as building a democracy with freedom and justice for all when all the African people were enslaved without being seen as fully human. That same mindset prioritized materialistic greed over humanity. Now, what I want us to think about as I kind of outline the questions that were driving my investigation, I want us to think about to what extent does that mindset still prevail today, and to what extent do we still see manifestations of the exploitations of millions to build somebody else's wealth, the disenfranchisement of Native people and forcing them to be subject to our commitments for lands, our commitments for rights, and then have them written away by the law. And most importantly, to what extent do we still see this nation and society dwelling in alternative facts and developing hegemonic narratives such as building a democracy with freedom and justice for all? I think that one's the one that really hits hard for many of us who hadn't heretofore thought about this notion of alternative facts. But that was brought to our attention, I think, with our previous president, who built his whole presidential campaign on the idea that it doesn't matter whether what I say is true. What matters is whether I can get people to believe it. So we've really dwelt in a social context of alternative facts from the nation's inception, but now I think it's kind of hitting many of us in the face who hadn't thought about it before. Also, the prioritization of materialistic greed over humanity, again, was at the inception and foundation of the nation, but guess what? It's alive and well today among many people, particularly people who are in the position to structure social policy. I'm going backwards. So, what did I find out? Well, one of the things is, in answer to that question, I began to see that it was indeed the cultural worldview and our socialization or mis-socialization into that worldview that was the driver. What do I mean by cultural worldview? Basically, all people have a culture, a way of life, that's structured by certain philosophical assumptions and principles that inform not only their perceptions, their thoughts, their feelings, their behavior, and ultimately their experience, but also shape their patterns of interpreting reality as well as their designs for living. So the kind of patterns for interpreting reality we've been socialized into that impacts our health so negatively is our materialistic ontological premise, or a premise about the nature of reality that is restricted to the five senses. That's problematic on many levels, not the least of which is the science does not support that idea. In fact, the height of our science through quantum physics and neurosciences lets us know, although we don't know what to do with it, many of us, that reality is essentially a spiritual phenomenon. And as that energy slows down, slower and slower, our five senses are able to appercept what is extant. But what we appercept isn't informed by what we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. Actually, our pre-programming informs what we perceive from our five senses. Also problematic is the external epistemology. Epistemology refers to what we're assuming is true about the nature of knowledge. And in this social context, we've been socialized to believe what is true is external to us. And we know by counting and measuring. Thus, our science and our social science is troubled by the fact that we don't know by interrogating our own sense of right or wrong, our own sense of what's true for us or not, but we really function based on what one black psychologist, Naim Akbar, called democratic sanity, and that's at some level democratic health. If most people do it, then it must be okay. If not, it's at least normal. So our external epistemology really limits our capacity to be in touch with knowing in a more intimate and character integrity-based way. Axiologically, we place highest value on acquisition of objects. And we totally disregard the interconnectedness and interdependence of all things. Our reasoning, our logic is dichotomous. Our reasoning is such that, well, either this is right or that's right. That either or kind of reasoning really omits another option in terms of reasoning, which is to see how this is right and that is right. Both are right in their own way at the same time. So that, for example, that pattern of interpreting reality that traps us in diunital logic doesn't allow us to understand that, let me see an example. If I were to ask you, do you think the earth is moving? Most people would say, well, no, not. But then we know it is because, we just don't know. So what we realize is the answer is, yeah, it's moving and not moving at the same time, depending on the perspective. If from a macro perspective, it's not moving because it just is. It's present. From a micro perspective, we find that quantum physics tells us everything is moving. Even this pen has electrons whirling up to speeds of 40,000 miles per second. It's only going to contribute to our getting it wrong when we're limited to our dichotomous logic, as opposed to a diunital logic, both end. And last but not least, our pattern of interpreting reality, as I suggested just a few minutes ago, is that truth is arbitrary. Also, our designs for living impact our health in very troublesome ways. Our designs for living emphasize materialism, individualism, competition, a might makes right attitude, greed, power, and control over others, a superficial focus. For example, we've become much more concerned about being politically correct than about being morally correct. That superficial focus always trips us up because we're concerned about representation, supposedly, and diversity and inclusion, not understanding just because you have a group of people who look a particular way doesn't mean that since you've now included them, you have diversity. What we need to begin to think about is a little bit deeper than appearance. What is going on with your thinking, your mindset, your belief system? When we begin to incorporate that level of diversity, substantive diversity, and get beyond our superficial focus, then we can be onto something relative to representation and true diversity and inclusion. Another characteristic of our design for living is it encourages spiritual alienation. That's reflected in the fact that we really are troubled by our capacity for moral reasoning, our capacity for determining what is just, because the spiritual anchor that's needed for that kind of positioning has been disrupted, and there is spiritual alienation. Last but not least, and we could go on and on with this list, but I'll end with this one. We have a design for living that socially sanctions systems of injustice and dehumanization. How do we live in a society, or how does one live in a society where the people you pay to serve and protect you might kill you for no justifiable reason, and then, following the historic pattern, you won't be held accountable. Nothing will happen to you. You can clearly see those patterns of interpreting reality and designs for living, or I should say, I can clearly see how those patterns of interpreting reality and designs for living really prevent us from getting to health. So, more explicitly, the worldview of a caste chattel enslaved, those who caste chattel enslaved Africans and their progeny fostered a system where we had to learn to endure a level of brutal dehumanization never before seen in the history of humankind, engage in a resistance and liberation struggles as African people, despite the odds, pursue the development of extended family despite circumstances of the offspring creation. So we found in chattel enslavement, whether the offspring produced by that African woman was a product of rape, which most times it was, if it wasn't a breeding farm, still led that mother to be sorry if the child was sold away, and at the first opportunity seek how to reconnect. What are you thinking? How are you conceiving the world that that's your orientation to that kind of treatment, that kind of social environment? I found that question intriguing and warranting a clear answer. Last, again, how do you maintain sanity in the face of a socially sanctioned terrorism without rights and emerge as the moral and spiritual leaders? I would say if you're able to do that, you may very, very well be the miracles of modern time. So, as we begin to look at the cultural socialization of what I'm calling the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, what do we learn about their patterns of interpreting reality? Well, one thing we learn is that rather than the materialist ontology with a separate and secondary spiritual aspect that may be considered, that ontological premise is that reality is both spiritual and material as one. All is spirit, mind, energy, consciousness, supreme being, God, goddess, whatever term you have for that totality macro system. And our epistemology is that self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge. But again, self in that cultural worldview is multidimensional. Self isn't this individual form. Self includes those who came before, the ancestors, those who will come after, future generations, all of nature and community. I don't have a self exclusive of those multiple dimensions. Axiologically, highest value is in communal, spiritual, and collective well-being. And the worldview itself is holistic, integrative, and emphasizes spiritual unification, transcendent focus, and human divinity. That's a very different cultural worldview than we've been socialized into by this dominant culture, but I submit that's the cultural worldview and the patterns of interpreting reality that allowed non-immigrant Africans kidnapped and trafficked to America as chattel. That's the worldview that allowed them to survive 250 years, if not 350. What were the designs for living? Well, we can go back to the earliest historical records and find that spiritual acumen, character, morality, ethics in the tradition of Ma'at. Ma'at is coming to us from classical African civilization, Nubia, Kemet, cultural and historical context. Ma'at was embodiment of certain principles, including love, peace, justice, truth, reciprocity, order, balance, and harmony. And we see their entire system, social system, was structured based on those values and principles, and they lasted at least 5,000 to 6,000 years that we can document. Oneness with nature, the ancestors' community, was a part of the design for living, and achievement of conscious union with the divine was the purpose of life. Very different from our socialization and experience. But I think on an intuitive level, hopefully you can begin to sense how, if that was indeed your cultural worldview, if those were your patterns of interpreting reality and your designs for living, you could probably endure most anything and come out as a moral and spiritual leaders. I wanted to put this in because I wanted you to see some of the written text that kind of reflect this wisdom tradition. And this is coming to us from the book of the Knowing the Creations, or the Hosea, translated by Milana Karenga, Sacred Wisdom from Ancient Egypt. And it's from the creation of Ra as Ka, which would be in their language of symbolic imagery and rhythm, the creation of God as human consciousness. And it says, indeed, every word of God came into being through that which the heart and mind thought and the tongue commanded. Thus, by means of the word, all faculties and qualities were fashioned and created, which furnish and yield all nourishment. And thus, justice is given to one who does justice is given to one who does what is loved, and punishment is given to one who does what is hated. Thus also is life given to the peaceful, and death given to one who violates the law. And I won't have time today to go into a deep discussion of that text, but let me say that these ancient people referred to their language as the Medu Neter, literally meaning the words of the divine, such that they thought and they saw the thoughts, the ideas, the words that came to them as coming directly from the divine, because they saw themselves as one with the divine. So my theory of optimal psychology and its orientation to health really looks at the nature of consciousness. As I said before, underpinning of the cultural worldview at the level of cultural deep structure are assumptions and are a set of assumptions or a conceptual system that informs perceptions, thoughts, feelings, behavior, and experience. What I call a suboptimal conceptual system is materialistic, fragmented, disintegrative, leading to insecurity, fearfulness, anxiety, depression, addictions, violence, and is the basis for the societal isms. Racism, sexism, classism, ageism, all those isms really are a function of this fragmented, fractured, disintegrative cultural worldview that separates the human being or the inherent from the spiritual aspect of being. So people are socialized in this worldview to try to gain a sense of peace and security and well-being from the material external realm, which can't provide it. By its nature, it's finite and limited. As a consequence, it leaves adherence to this particular set of assumptions insecure, fearful, prone to anxiety, prone to depression, prone to addictions, violence, and being racist, sexist, classist, and all those societalisms. In contrast, I was able to identify an optimal conceptual system, which is holistic and integrative, leading to an intrinsic sense of worth and identity. I'm worthy simply because I am. And a oneness with source, nature, and all. And it's the basis for sustainable well-being beyond appearances. I wish I could let you answer or ask questions in the midst of this, but I probably am running out of time already, so let me quickly go on. So, our challenge relative to health and health matters is to heal going forward in order to build a healthy future. In so doing, then, we must honor the Creator, the Divine Spirit, which is in all and which is all. We must increase true self-knowledge, let go of that false sense of self that has us basing our identity and self-worth on external criteria, how we look, our income, our position, our education, where we got it, how much we got, kind of car we drive, where we live, what we own, what we control. All those things won't give us that basic sense of peace, value, security, and well-being all humans so desperately need. We'll get some when we want. What? More and more and more and more and more. And whatever it takes to try to fill that void, we'll do without consideration of its impact on the common good, the collective good, the greater good of the whole, and not realizing if it affects the whole, the common good negatively, ultimately it will affect us. So increasing in knowledge of our true self is essential. Increasing our knowledge of self as intrinsically worthy, one with the divine infinite expression of such a creative life force. We have to learn how we can manifest an optimal health consciousness. Engage in what I call a process of optimization, which is a developmental process where we become into fuller and fuller knowledge of our true selves. We begin to use our power to define reality and legislate it in ways that are helpful and beneficial to us and all. We also can learn how to create a culture of health, which if I have time, I'll briefly speak to, as well as a psychology and cultural model of health. In doing this, we will be able to stand for that which is true, just, and righteous, which is foundational to not only our individual personal health, but the collective health. And in so doing, we will be able to build a just, sacred, and sustainable world. Because the world we built now, based on that fragmented suboptimal view, certainly isn't just, definitely not sacred, and it's been demonstrated it's not sustainable. So let's switch it up. Let's shift our consciousness. And that's what the whole purpose of engaging in the optimization process does, which I'll briefly outline. But before I go there, let me talk a little bit about what optimal health consciousness actually is. It's a consciousness whereby our mind becomes the mind of pure light, meaning when we make decisions, our decisions are such that our heart is as light as a feather when weighed on the scale of truth. Our heart isn't hardened, our heart isn't heavy, but it remains as light as a feather when weighed on the scale of truth. And how we get to that place is by generating those qualities which I characterized as the principles of Ma'at. We have to start from a place of love. Self-love is the basis of all knowledge, as is self-knowledge the basis of all knowledge. And from that love, we'll get a sense of peace. And the peace will require us to demand justice. And we'll realize there can't be justice without truth. So all this business of denying people access to truth or letting people speak truth is counter to health and sustainable well-being. But when we allow truth, we realize that truth requires reciprocity. I can share my truth, but I want you to share your truth. And as we each lay our perspectives on the table, we can figure out, if we're steeped in love and peace and justice, which way to go and what's right. From that reciprocity, then an order is established. And from the order, we can create a balance and a harmony. As we create this optimal health consciousness, we want our cognitive, affective, and behavioral choices to be in line with the divinely spirited aliveness. We want our scope to be comprehensive, coherent, and cohesive as we practice knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. We want to be aligned with and supported by those who have come before in this tradition of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And we want our mind to be open to the full possibilities of that divine creative life force. How do we get there? Well, one of the ways that I've suggested based on my work, and it's been adopted and utilized by so many thousands, if not millions of people, is the optimization process. The first thing we have to do is decide what we're going to believe is true. What's true about reality? What principles and assumptions are going to be a part of our conceptual system? Are we believing that our true self is one with the source of all good? That we are holistically integrating the multiple dimensions of human diversity, honoring nature, the ancestors, the community, the yet unborn future generations for a comprehensive, cohesive, coherent, divinely spirited aliveness? Is that what we're believing? Or are we believing what we've been socialized to believe based upon the dominant culture's socialization? So that if we're believing that the world is essentially that fragmented materialist construction we've been socialized to, and we view ourselves from a perspective of selfish self-interest, we have a need to feel superior to others. Our identity and self-worth is based on external criteria. And we tend to squelch feelings, particularly if we feel they're negative, because they're filled with insecurity and fear, greed, envy, jealousy, anger, shame, guilt, etc. We will be prone to depression, anxiety, addictions, violence, a might makes right attitude, dis-ease, either or logic, control over, and oppression of others. But based on the optimal worldview of our ancestors from the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, even if that's where we are, that's okay, because it's only come to us as an opportunity for growth and development, edification, so we can master our life lessons. So when I say it's okay, it's not okay to keep it perpetuated. It's okay to recognize it for what it is, why it's allowed, why it's come. The purpose of negativity in human experience is growth, edification, and mastery of life lessons. What we can see from this chart is that when we master those lessons, we can then return to the greater knowledge of self and capacity for health. This cyclic process, I call the optimization process, starts if we've decided to be on the optimal side with our existing in this social context, probably experiencing some sense of separation from this optimal truth over into the fragmented side. But again, if we master the process of bringing the conscious awareness what we're feeling, we examine the self-talk that has allowed those feelings to find a home in our heart and mind. And we then cut to the chase of what we're truly believing about the world, ourselves, and who we are. And we master the lesson that negativity has come to teach. We can then return to our greater self-knowledge. Mastery of this cycle will look something like, oh, when I find myself taken away from the definition I desire, this is the most horrible thing that can happen. But I master the lessons. I come back clearer, stronger. The next time I'm taken away, I'm saying, oh, what a challenge. Mastery, back to the true self. The next time, oh, what an opportunity. Mastery, coming back to the true self. Ultimately, it's said that we will not be separated so much as become aware of separation is possible, and we see that as a blessing. Ultimately, realizing that we now have unified, contained, and transcended all opposition. So, I don't know if many want to get there. Hopefully, they do. And we now have a methodology that's foolproof. Now, again, how am I doing for time? If anybody's checking.
Oh, we want to have a few. We've got. We actually have only about 10 more minutes. I'd love to have some questions.
Oh, we're good then.
Okay.
If I can make this. Yay! I love questions. Thank you for the question.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm so glad Brunel brought you into the fold. My name is China Gersner, and I'm a parishioner here at All Saints. And one of the things that I love about All Saints is we create safe spaces for brave conversations. And that's where we are. We really need to have more of this where people find a safe space to figure this out. You know, we've gotten to a place in the pandemic where we had two pandemics. You know, we had the pandemic of COVID, and then the underlying theme of what's been going on since the beginning of society for African American people. And I could speak to that because my mom's from Mississippi, and I'm the descendants of Native American, African American, and Irish folks. So I just want to ask you, how do we create more safe spaces, and what do we fill those spaces with to have those brave conversations? If you could give us some suggestions.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. How do we create those safe spaces? Well, I think you probably are on the right track since you've done it once here. But my only recommendation is that you continue, and you start with first creating what? That safe space in you. Create that safe space in you. And what I mean by that is when I've created a safe space in me, meaning I've really come to seeing myself as who I am, as the individual unique expression of a divine creative life force whose nature is love, the source of all good, my worth is intrinsic, I have no fear. What am I to fear? And I'm sure you get that from your All Saints teachings from the Bible as well. That ancient sacred text, by the way, is rooted in the wisdom tradition of African deep thought. But not to get off topic, how do we create that safe space? We created within ourselves. And then, once we created it within ourselves, guess what? Everywhere we're going, what are we bringing with us?
Ourselves.
Safe space.
Yeah, a safe space.
Safe space. And then as we come together, all having created safe space within ourselves, oh my God, we have a community of safe space where people can take anything and everything. And it's okay. Because if you disagree, thank you. You're giving me something to stretch and think about. If you're upset, say I'm upset. You're pissing me off, Dr. Myers.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. Because again, the process I'm arguing for in terms of creating an optimal health consciousness is one where we're elevating our consciousness. But it has to start with self-knowledge. And when I have started there and created that space within myself, I become fearless. I become fearless. I don't worry you disagree. I don't worry if you're feeling any of those negative feelings, shame, guilt. Get over it. I had to get over it. My ancestors had to get over it. In fact, I'm still being bombarded with that lie, if I'm black, on a daily, moment by moment basis. Not only bombarded with it, but it's woven into the social and political legislative structure. So anyway, I'm simply saying this. Find the safe space in you, bring it with you where you go, and let people know. Try to be so immersed in that love that when you're saying things that would ordinarily upset people, they may be upset for a little bit, but if you encourage them to look within themselves and see what's upsetting them, what's upsetting you? Why are you upset? Who are you really? What values have you been adhering and living and manifesting? And if it's that suboptimal, which more times than not it will be in this social context, forgive yourself. Promise to do better. Promise that higher self, that divine self within you, to pay attention to it and honor it on a day-by-day, moment-by-moment basis. So that's the long answer to your question.
Oh, amen. That'll preach. We got time for one more. Does someone have one more question? One more. Oh, we got back here. So, yeah.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I'm honored that I came here, because I'm from Seattle, Washington, to even hear you speak. You have all mostly white people in this room. You know who should be here the most? You and me, especially me. And I just want to thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And also, what you say, believe in yourself. You don't believe in yourself, nobody else will. That's the one thing I got from this, and thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Pat, were you? Yeah, let me run right over. Thank you so much, Charles. Here, Pat. She can't hear you. She can't hear you.
Oh, she can't hear me, okay. So my question is really about the picture that's on the screen. I was going to ask you if you could go back to the culture of health and give us a little bit more on that. So were you going to talk about this particular slide?
I am.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, then I'm good.
So we talked just a minute ago about optimal health consciousness. And as we move to optimal health consciousness, then this tree really represents the culture of health we'll create. As you know, culture has at least two levels. The roots represent what we call the deep structure of culture. And the part of the tree we can see is the surface structure of culture. Most times when we talk about culture, we think about the cultural surface structure, our language, our dress, our music, our food. All that's well and good, but that's not the most important aspect of culture. Because what we need to do is to go deep into the cultural deep structure and find out what are the philosophical assumptions and principles that have given birth to the manifestation of the nature of that tree. And the culture of health I've illustrated here is from the wisdom tradition of African deep thought, where we're very much in touch of the unity between the seen and the unseen. So at the bottom, you'll see the roots are really grounded in love and an omnipotent, omnipresent, omnipotent, creative life force whose nature is love, the source of all things good, harmony, balance, health. And if those are the roots of our culture, then those will manifest in terms of a respect and reverence for life, a just system of organization, seeing community as family, living in harmony with nature and one another, recognition of the natural order of things, as opposed to, in this social context, oftentimes we think we have a better idea than nature or God. We'd have an educational system based on a comprehensive, cohesive, coherent knowledge, wisdom, and understanding in all areas of life. We would protect the most vulnerable. In fact, the strength of a society, of a culture, is judged by how well the most vulnerable are protected, the poor, the young, the infirm. We will pursue honest self-knowledge, and we pursue it with authenticity. as well as we would integrate and balance the dualities of being. The nature of being on the earth plane is always dualities. But how do we integrate and balance those dualities? How do we elevate the consciousness of ourselves and humanity? And as we begin to do so based on that optimal worldview, we now have a culture of health as illustrated by this tree.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know if you can hear people applauding, but they're applauding. Can we just one more time give thanks to Dr. Linda James Myers, everybody. Thank you so much. We want to have you back here, hopefully in person. It's 11:15. I got to help Keith get out of here and get back to church. So really quick, we have questions for further discussion. They're available on that table here and here. Dr. James Myers gave us 2 questions to consider. First is, health is more than just the absence of disease. How would you define or describe health? Second, some of the social determinants of health are said to be such things as economic stability, quality education and healthcare access, environmental factors, and social community context. What is one force underlying how each of these will likely manifest in the lives of most black citizens in this nation? And then we're going to look forward to next week, where we have Sherry Bonner from Planned Parenthood of Pasadena and San Gabriel Valley, and we're hoping a couple other guests here to really put the terms together and talk about public health. And we have this third question. Last week, Dr. Mankall told us that John Winthrop's City on a Hill was a warning that if we had a society that didn't care for each other, the world would see it, and it would be our shame as a nation. This week, Dr. James Myers told us of the many dimensions of health that depend on societal and not just individual factors. Given all this, what do you think an American society that attends to public health in a way that we could be proud of looks like? So we have these. You're welcome to stay here, get in small groups, use these questions for discussion, take them home, discuss them with friends and family, or just ponder them in your heart. And come back here next week and we'll continue the conversation. Again, thanks to Dr. Linda James Myers. Thanks to you. Thanks to everyone online. Peace. Thanks.